Welcome to Let's Talk Kenmore, a lighthearted podcast aimed at connecting our listeners to their local government and demystifying the role of government in the city of Kenmore. I'm your host, Amber Clifton. In this episode, I sit down with the city's principal planner, Todd Hall. Todd walks me through the housing strategy plan in the city of Kenmore. Please enjoy this episode of Let's Talk Kenmore. Hi, welcome to Let's Talk Kenmore. I am here today with our principal planner in community development, Todd Hall, and Todd is going to chat with me today about the housing strategy plan in Kenmore. Hi, Todd. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Amber. Thank you.
You're one of my faves to have on here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so housing strategy plan. Can you give me sort of a summary of what Kenmore's housing strategy plan is and why city staff is updating the current plan?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the city council adopted the original housing strategy plan back in 2017, which was essentially a roadmap for addressing affordable housing in the city. And out of that plan came several priorities, four of which were the highest priority to act on first. The first was about protecting affordable housing that already exists. That means things that, like a special overlay district to help preserve manufactured housing communities. The second is to look at accessory dwelling units, which are essentially small units located in the backyard of the main home, and whether the regulations, fees, utility requirements are actually making it easy or difficult to build them. And then the third priority was to look at unlocking publicly owned or tax exempt land for housing. The idea was being if the site is already publicly held, why not allow a special permit process to develop housing, particularly more affordable housing, and then thus allowing more diverse building types.
Right.
And then the fourth one is to expand the toolkit for developers building mixed use and multifamily projects, things like density bonuses, density transfers, and then the multifamily tax exemption program to incentivize affordability in those bigger developments. So, really, to summarize, protecting the affordable housing the city already has, removing barriers for small scale housing, activating underused public land, and then incentivizing affordability in larger projects.
Right. What's a density bonus? What does that mean?
Density bonus basically is you're getting additional units that, if you meet certain criteria, then in the code, if you do certain things, then you would get some additional units, which developers like because they,
Oh,
definitely want as many units as possible. But that's just one kind of idea that we have available.
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I'd never heard that term before. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, now why the city staff is updating the housing strategy plan, since the original plan was developed prior to several significant policy and legislative changes that, came about in the last few years. We need to, take a closer look at it right now. So it's definitely timely and necessary. So first, Kenmore completed a major comp plan update a couple of years ago in 2024,
Hmm.
and then we adopted a new housing element that had all new updated goals, policies, and objectives. And the element now requires an action-oriented implementation strategy to move from policy to actual practice.
Right.
And then the state legislature, Washington state legislature, has enacted a whole series of consequential housing bills requiring us to take a look at our existing regulatory framework. One thing to note that the city carries a housing growth target of more than 3,000 units by 2044, which is spelled out in our comp plan. And specifically, it talks about affordability benchmarks that's tied to households across all income spectrums. So meeting that target requires, a deliberate, proactive strategy. And then Kenmore Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Accessibility Plan was adopted in 2023. That established housing related objectives, and we need to coordinate that with our land use and planning work. And then lastly, The community itself has changed quite a bit since the original plan was adopted several years ago. It's now increasingly diverse. We've
Mhm.
got more than a third residents that identify as BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Mhm.
And then average home values, which is not a secret. Home
Right.
values just keep going up and up and up. It's now reached over $1 million in Kenmore, and so roughly 1 in 4 households, as a result, is house burdened, which basically means that they're spending a disproportionate share of their income on housing. So, really taking all these together, we just need to really take a new fresh look at the housing strategy plan, and address the changes that have happened both at the state legislature and then both in our local city and population.
Yeah. So is that 1.06 million? That's the average cost of a home in
That's
Kenmore?
that's that's a median cost. So that means that there's some that are going to be below that 1.06 million, and some that are above that. But that number, like I said, not surprisingly, has been moving up and up and up, not just in
Mhm.
Kenmore, but just county and region wide.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you mentioned policy changes at the state level. So can you explain what specific policy and legislative changes sort of prompted this update?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was several House bills specifically, basically in the last 3 to 4 years, those being 1110, 1337, and 1220. To go into those in more detail, 1110, the first one, was called the Middle Housing Bill, and
Mhm.
that required cities to allow a broader range of housing types that have been traditionally zoned exclusively for single family homes. So, not surprisingly, most of our communities are really focused in on single family housing. So,
Right.
what the idea of this bill was to specifically allow for, or actually require, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, a variety of different types that would increase the variety. Now, this isn't necessarily affordable type of housing, but this is just allowing for different types other than single family.
Gotcha.
So in 2025, Kenmore City Council adopted these amendments that would allow all these different types in our R4 and R6 zones, that just being like 4 units per acre, 6 unit per acre zones,
Mhm.
with some exceptions, because every city, including Kenmore, is no different. That we have a lot of critical areas, this being steep slopes and wetlands and streams. So that's
Right.
where there would be some exceptions to the housing, any housing types. The next one, the 1337 bill, that one was focused on accessory dwelling units. And again, you probably heard of the term ADUs.
Mhm.
This is really what your backyard cottage is, or, sometimes colloquially called mother in law
Right.
houses. And that's really to add, additional housing capacity in established neighborhoods. So, one thing that's new in the bill that a lot of jurisdictions had when they first adopted these type of ADUs code is they prohibited rental. It had to be an owner occupied residence, meaning that, the owner had to live on site. And now
Oh.
that's no longer. And so this basically opens the door to, loosening up the regulations. Additionally, this legalizes two ADU lots, including attached types and detached types.
Mm, mhm.
And then it also caps the impact fees being those fees that are charged by the city or another partnering jurisdiction, such as the school district. So this would be your school impact fees, your transportation impact fees. This is fees we charge new development. And so
Mhm.
we're not charging those fees for ADU types.
In theory, a person could have a downstairs mother-in-law apartment and then also like a detached cottage,
True,
and that used
exactly.
to not be acceptable. Am I
Yeah,
understanding that correctly? Like it had
that's right.
Okay, okay.
Yep,
Wow.
yep. So you could any kind of combination. Still you're going to have requirements for setbacks, meaning how far the structure has to be from
Right.
a side or a rear, but essentially, if you meet all the varying dimensional requirements that are in our municipal code, then you can have, one or two ADUs on
That's
your
cool.
property. So
Good to know.
lastly, the Housing Bill 1220, this one really talks about not just encouraging, but also planning and accommodating affordable housing. So, I talked earlier about, we have this benchmark or target to meet our affordable housing needs. And what this talks about specifically is, having accommodating for all income levels. This would be types such as emergency housing and shelters. We talk about what step housing, that's supportive or transitional housing. So 1220 really looked at this, and it really now provides counties and cities to have to meet specific projections to meet those at across all income levels. So
Mhm.
with all three of these bills, it's been quite a significant shift in what cities, including Kenmore, has to do to meet and accommodate for housing. And so this housing strategy plan is really going to start focusing in on what we need to do as a city to accommodate for those.
When we talked before on the podcast when we were discussing middle housing, that's
Yeah,
just Bill 1110,
that's
right?
that's right.
And now
Yep,
there's these 3, this is sort of all encompassing.
that's right. Yep,
Gotcha.
yep.
Wow. Okay. So we talked about middle housing in 2025, and that was to encourage like development of the duplexes, the triplexes, all of that. And new regulations were adopted by city council. So with the regulations being implemented for not quite a year now, what are you seeing so far? Like where do you think things will be going from here in terms of construction of these actual houses?
Yeah, so I mean, since it's only been, about a year or so, to be perfectly honest, we haven't seen a lot of traction yet. It takes several years for things to kind of, once you implement a new code, then the development community, of course, needs to understand what they can and can't do. And, it takes a little bit of time to see changes happening. We're seeing a handful of ADUs being permitted in Kenmore.
Hmm.
Most builders still are going through their larger home plan types, which they've been used to, which is understandable, right? They've been doing the same model for decades,
Right.
building these large, 3,500, 4,000 square foot houses. And now
Mhm.
all of a sudden you have to accommodate for different types of housing. And so I think over time we'll see that paradigm shift away from these larger homes, and we'll start seeing some of these middle housing types come in. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, and it's anybody's guess on when that's going to actually happen. And
Right.
that's because there's really a lot of factors in the home building business, from how much land's available, what the demand is, what
Mhm.
the financing costs are, both on the home buyer side and also the home construction side, right? A lot of the builders, they have to take out loans to be able to build a certain number of houses. They don't have just a whole pile of cash just ready
Right.
to go. They have to borrow money too to be able to
Sure.
build these. So, and then of course, every builder has to make some sort of profitability. So when all these planets align, so to speak, then the building community's going to be a little bit less reluctant, and then
Mhm.
you'll start seeing a lot more of these different types over time.
Okay. That's good to know. And this applies to rent. Just isn't just for home sales, right? This is for rent as well. So this is kind of covering the gamut of
Yeah, totally.
okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of manufactured homes in Kenmore. So for Kenmore residents who are worried about rising costs and availability of affordable housing, such as manufactured homes, is the city doing anything to protect those communities?
This is, a very real concern for our Kenmore residents, and it's honestly one that the city's been actively working on for a number of years. You're correct that Kenmore does have quite a few manufactured home communities, and in fact, Kenmore is actually somewhat unique in this respect because we're one of the few communities in North King County with a significant number of manufactured homes, and we're nearly 300 units among 6 different communities throughout the city. There's really shortage of these types, and that's because they're, being redeveloped. Land values is
Mhm.
really the amongst the number one reason of, over time the land underneath where these homes sit is just worth a lot of money to the owner, and then they end up selling, and then it's redeveloped into something different than
Right.
what's currently there. So naturally these manufactured home communities represent some of the most affordable housing types in the city. And it's important to mention that more than half of the residents in manufactured homes are low income, meaning
Mhm.
that there's families that are generally at or below 50 to 80% AMI. That's just area median income.
Mhm.
For instance, in 2025 in King County for a family of four, the AMI is 135,000. So, say at the 50 to 80% AMI level for a family household, this would equate to a salary range anywhere between 67,500 to say up $108,000.
Right.
So unfortunately, like I was saying, manufactured home communities across King counties, they've been closing as a result of property values rising and then those owners selling. And once that land is converted, that affordability is essentially eliminated and lost.
Yeah.
So Kenmore recognized this trend, of closures early. And so since I'd say the late 2010s, the city and the council has been looking at, rezoning, different types of manufactured home communities, essentially saving those zones so they're not redeveloped.
Right.
And so now we have restrictions on those properties to change from their current use, which really provides a meaningful protective layer that most cities in the region just really haven't pursued that. That's why you're seeing a lot of these closures. And so
Mhm.
this ordinance that they adopted would make it less likely that there would be closures, obviously making it a hardship on the residents there because they have to eventually move out,
Right.
because they no longer have a place to live. And so the cities really wants to try to maintain that. And the housing strategy plan, at least back in the first iteration, looked at the manufactured home community overlay as a top priority. And so especially those for the parks that are along 522, we have a number of parks that are just north of 522, say
Mhm.
between 68th and 73rd. And those are ones that we would really like to maintain because they're a very important component of affordable housing. So
Right.
basically to say that we've taken a lot of steps really to save this type of housing, and we're intending to strengthen our protections as we go forward.
Good. Good. I'm glad to hear that. So, Kenmore is growing rapidly. You already had touched on that earlier. So, where do you see the biggest challenges in actually getting housing built?
That's really the central tension in housing planning. There's a gap between what the city's planned for on paper
Mhm.
and then really what actually gets built on the ground. Kenmore isn't any exception. And I think there's, several challenges that are worth naming. First, which I mentioned earlier, is land cost and just
Mhm.
market feasibility. Kenmore sits in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. Our average home values, like I mentioned earlier, are over $1 million now, and
Mhm.
that underlying land cost makes it extremely difficult to finance affordable housing units without some kind of significant subsidy.
Right.
So developers, have been building market rate housing. They potentially can absorb these costs if they're willing to do it. But there's also developers in the affordable housing business, that
Right.
specifically just build those types of unit. It makes it more difficult. The gap has to basically be filled somewhere. So that's through, tax credits, maybe public land that the city owns that we could negotiate to try to get something happening. There's grants. And then I mentioned this multifamily tax exemption. So
Right.
these are potentially resources that are available, but they're also very limited and they're competitive. Second challenge is infrastructure capacity. So the growth targets assume that roads and utilities and stormwater systems can support the development,
Mhm.
but there's some parts in the city, we can accommodate the density, but there's some areas that the infrastructure would have to be upgraded, and as you can imagine, that's going to take quite a bit of capital investment
Oh,
and
yeah.
money from both sides, both the city and the builder.
Mhm.
Another one is the regulatory environment. The city's in the process of updating its codes to comply with, new state housing legislation, like I mentioned, middle housing and ADUs. But until that work's complete, there can be uncertainty in the permitting environment, and that causes developers to, kind of wait and see what's going to happen.
Right.
And so we have to streamline and modernize our code, and that obviously takes time because it's dependent on staff capacity. We've got a lot of things going on.
Yeah. Gosh, the trickle down effect
Oh,
is
I know, totally.
yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, there's honestly just a lot of issues that, have an impact on, affordability. I think lastly, just to mention, affordable housing just really takes an intentional effort on the city's part to have it built rather than just relying on market rate housing. The
right.
market really is going to build what pencils out financially, and it really requires the city to be proactive, to pursue partnerships with our varying agencies, and we just have to use every tool in the toolbox that we have available. And so the housing strategy plan is really an effort to try to get those tools put in place, and we can
Mhm.
deploy those, but we have to translate this at some point into units, and it's going to take a commitment not just by the city but our other partners over many, many years.
Right. So, as far as community engagement, what's some things that you could expect this summer as far as getting the people of Kenmore engaged with this plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're just kicking this project off, and our team is, just starting to discuss the various options that we could consider to meet with our residents.
Mhm.
And we're definitely committed to reaching residents who haven't always had a seat at the table.
Yeah.
You know that there's folks that have a tendency to be more participatory in the events that we do have, but are because this crosses all different income levels, we want to see folks such as our renters and our manufactured housing residents and our growing BIPOC community to be engaged and involved. So
Mhm.
we're hoping to be out there in the community in various ways this summer. We will inform people, of course, through our many channels like the e-news and social media methods. But I would imagine that we're going to be out at several farmers markets this summer. I know there's several planned events
Mhm.
that the city holds over the course of the spring and summer that I or others of my team are going to be coming out to. Essentially, we want to go where people are versus
Yeah.
the traditional method of like, hey, we're having a meeting at city hall, why don't you come and join
Right.
us, because that hasn't always proven the most successful. So we want to go where people are to try to
Mhm.
make it a little bit more successful. And then of course we always have discussions at our planning commission. Those are going to continue throughout 2026, and we hold those on the first and third Tuesdays of every month. So just stay tuned on our website on when we'll be talking about it. And as part of those meetings, we're going to be inviting staff who's going to help us on this housing strategy plan from ARCH, which
Mm.
stands for a Regional Coalition for Housing.
Oh,
And
wow.
they're basically our kind of housing experts, because we, as city of Kenmore, wear a lot of hats, but we don't claim to be perfect experts in housing. So
Mhm.
they'll help us out on working through those strategies and policies as we develop the housing strategy plan. They'll be a great asset to help us through that
Right.
process.
That's awesome. And yeah, the farmers market is a great way to engage with folks. You and I sat next to each other last year a couple times.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
this year we'll prepare for the extreme heat a little bit better.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Anything else you want the folks to know about this housing strategy plan before we sign off?
No, I mean, I really just want to thank you for, inviting me again. It's, as you know, we've had a number of these housing type things you and I have talked about on the podcast over the last couple of years. And,
Mhm.
this is another way that we want to ensure to the city residents that, we are hearing from our community that, there's struggles out there of affordability, that, we want to listen to and hear from our community members on what keeps them up at night on housing
Mm.
challenges. And
Mhm.
so I think, this will be just a way to engage our community and listen to what our various, affordable housing residents in particular, have challenges with. And so I really hope and encourage you to engage and speak with us. And anytime you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with myself or the team, community development team.
Yeah. Agreed. You are a wealth of knowledge and so approachable and easy to talk to. So if you see Todd out there at the events, don't be shy. Don't be shy. He's the really, really tall guy at the city.
That's right.
You are such a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate all the hard work that you're doing in the city.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. I
Yeah.
appreciate your time.
All right. I will see you at the market this summer.
Yeah, will do.
Take care. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Let's Talk Kenmore. Be sure to check back for more interesting topics and conversations. And as always, don't forget to ask yourself, where's the fun?